Well,
Good.
turn me off.
First, I'd like just to say, the timing of the speaker next week is fortuitous because, on the next day, our first manned mission is going up in like 15 years or something. And that was probably planned by Dana. Our speaker today is Wolfy Rougle. Wolfy is a Forest Health Watershed Coordinator with the Butte County Resource Conservation District. She was born and raised in Annapolis, Maryland, and moved to California to get her BS in International Agriculture Development from UC Davis. She then attended Chico State, where she earned a master's degree in public administration. Wolfy is a longtime self-described botany geek and a geographic information systems developer. In other words, she makes maps on the computer. Wolfy will share how her organization is helping Butte County forest owners get the right trees back on the landscape in the right places to replace those lost in the campfire. Wolfy, thank you so much for joining us, and it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Phil. How's my volume? Can everyone hear me pretty well? Well, I guess you can't really answer. I guess I'm just going to keep talking. So thanks so much for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm Wolfy Rougle. I work for the Resource Conservation District, or as we call it, the RCD. And I'm here to share with you our overall reforestation philosophy that we've developed since the campfire, which can be summed up as plant trees, not too many, mostly oaks. If you're wondering what the RCD actually is, you're not the only one out there. We are a special district, so a locally controlled special district, in some ways similar to a mosquito control district or an irrigation district. We provide services to people who live in a certain area. In our case, people who live in Butte County, mostly in the unincorporated areas. We're locally controlled by a board of directors who are appointed by the board of supervisors. But we don't get any taxpayer money from Butte County property taxes or anything like that. We're entirely funded by grants and contracts. So we compete for grants along with other districts and nonprofits for all of our funding. And our mission is to protect, enhance, and support the natural resources and agriculture of Butte County by working with willing landowners and citizens. So we are not a regulatory agency in any way. And we do that through education, land management, which can be planning or doing projects on the ground. So we were going along, helping to improve natural surface trails and helping farmers improve their irrigation systems and stuff like that, which is very important. And then this happened. And we realized that we were going to need to help Butte County respond to this tragedy that we all endured. And we can't fix everything at once, but we can help in our own way. And we realized that reforestation and post-fire restoration in the areas where it was needed was probably the best way for us to pitch in and help out. To give a little more background, RCDs are kind of unique in the way that they're able to work on federal lands, on state lands, on private lands. We can work with the CSU Chico reserves. We can work a lot of different places, and we can get funding from a lot of different places. So when there are those gaps in conservation that are created by having a checkerboard ownership and things like that, RCDs can sometimes be really useful in bridging those gaps. So to do that, we created this Watershed Coordinator project. This is funded by the California Department of Conservation right now. This purple outline is just where we kind of are working and focused on watershed restoration. This is sort of the forested portion of Butte County. And this is where I do my job as a Forest Health Watershed Coordinator. My job has four main parts. One is creating and planning projects along with all the people who own and manage the forest to make it a better place. Another big one is grant writing to bring money into Butte County so we can actually do these projects and get our forests in better shape. Another one is the Prescribed Burn Association, which is there to just help ordinary landowners get more comfortable with putting good fire on the ground responsibly. And then a fourth component is our natural surface roads and trails work. That's my colleague Thad is mostly the one who works on that. I think he may have spoken to you about the Butte County Trails Plan a few years ago. So don't ask me any hard questions about roads and trails because I won't be able to answer them. But today I'm going to talk about our reforestation and post-fire restoration philosophy. And I'm going to take you through two big projects that are affected by that. The Concow Resilience Project, which surprisingly is in Concow, and then the Paradise Ridge replanting recommendations that we've developed and are continuing to refine. First, let's talk about Paradise. This is what part of Paradise looked like right after the fire. This is just kind of a random aerial snip that I took of Paradise Ridge. This is what that exact same part of Paradise looked like right before the fire. This isn't a particularly dense part of the Paradise urban forest. I think we can all agree there were a lot of trees on the ridge before the fire. Definitely too many in places. The forest was pretty dense and unhealthy, which isn't very unusual because most of California's forests are too dense and unhealthy right now. It's not just Butte County that has this problem at all. And it's something that people are grappling with across the state. But now we're in the position where we need to replant some of the trees that we lost in the fire. In Paradise and Magalia alone, they estimated right after the fire that they'd lost about 1/3 trees. And since then, that number has definitely risen. We've seen a lot more trees that were it turned out they were just hanging on to say goodbye. So knowing that we need to restore these trees and knowing that the forest that we lost wasn't really something we necessarily want to restore exactly as it was, what should the next forest look like? Well, there are kind of two elements to a forest, you know, how far apart the trees are and what kind of trees they are. When it comes to how far apart they are, the town of Paradise has been pretty progressive since the fire in developing a fairly comprehensive defensible space ordinance with lots of setbacks from everything you can imagine, from structures, from other trees, from power lines, of course, that's very important. The town will be enforcing that. So the number of trees that people can plant on their lots is kind of set by the town, at least if you're within the town borders. When it comes to what species people should select, though, we realized that was someplace we could help out. So we kind of convened a technical advisory committee of a bunch of local foresters. We asked CAL FIRE for their input. We asked the town. We asked local longtime residents, and we even asked scientists from UC Davis and CSU Chico to provide their input too about what might be the best trees with a chance of success for Paradise's new urban forest. And so we selected trees that were native, trees that were known to be fire resilient, and trees that we thought would have a good chance of being climate resilient too. I'll talk a little bit about climate resilience. This is a little bit of like a climate science geek out here, but some people will appreciate it. Right now we're looking at a slide from the Seed Zone Tracker, which is developed at UC Davis. Phil mentioned that I'm a geographic information systems person, so I do love staring at maps. I will definitely do it all day. And right now, where that blue squiggle is the part of Butte County that is between 1,500 feet and 2,000 feet in elevation. So this cuts right across Lower Paradise. And it's important to us to have an idea, even though we can't have perfect knowledge about what might happen in the future, about what kind of climate these trees are going to face as they grow into young trees, adolescent trees, mature trees, and finally, we hope, the old trees that are going to really anchor the forest and provide that special sense of being in an old forest that I think we can all pick up on and revel in when we're in a woodland. Here's a close-up of the part of that blue squiggle that runs right through Paradise. So you can see that's about the lower half of the town of Paradise, spilling down onto Neal Road. And so what the Seed Zone Climate Tracker allows you to do is it allows you to look at, and this was commissioned by and paid for CAL FIRE, because they're also the Board of Forestry. And they're kind of charged with keeping California's forests healthy and keeping them fire resilient and keeping them carbon sinks and not carbon sources, as we kind of all experienced during the campfire. So what the Seed Zone Climate Tracker allows you to do is look at the place where you want to plant your trees, choose a climate model or future conditions that you think might be plausible, and then look at where in California you might want to get the seeds from that are already experiencing and presumably adapted to the climate that you expect in your home site in the future. And it allows you to pick 3 different models that the state of California, in its wisdom, have deemed likely to be future climate models. Under one model, you can see that over the next 30 years or so, Southern Paradise will become a lot more like Butte County between 1,000 and 1,500 feet. So if you just go down Neal Road a little bit, down into Upper Park, where it's really blue oak and gray pine dominated, those are kind of the climate conditions that Southern Paradise can expect over the near lifetime of the trees that we're going to plant this year and next year. If we go to another model, shows exactly the same thing. If we go to the third model, the different thing about this model is now we're looking at all of California searching for that green zone. Where is it? There isn't one, because this is a model that predicts that in addition to getting warmer, the climate might also get wetter. It may not be the most likely outcome, but it is possible. At least a bunch of climate scientists say it might be possible. And if Butte County gets both warmer and wetter, then there just won't be any place else in California that has those conditions. So it'll kind of be a novel climate on the planet, and we'll just see what happens. So we can't really plan for that scenario, but given that the way to plan for climate change in Butte County is probably to look downhill and see what's coming, we recommended that people do just that they look downhill at the vegetation community that's about 500 feet below them, sometimes even more, and plant trees that are adapted to those conditions. So based on that, again, with the input of a bunch of foresters and other local experts, we created this map that we used this spring to, when we were giving away thousands of seedlings to Paradise and Magalia residents for Arbor Week in early March. We recommend that people are just planting blue oaks south of about Pearson. And as you travel northward, it's a really good idea to plant more black oaks. Ponderosa pines and incense cedars are the 2 most drought and heat tolerant conifers that are native to Butte County. So we definitely recommend people plant those as you move through middle and northern Paradise. And then finally, when you get up to Magalia and go uphill from there, you can think about adding some sugar pines and Doug firs in the cooler microclimates that you might have up there. So again, the point of this is that, when it gets too hot and if we have longer droughts, more severe droughts, trees that aren't very well adapted to them, individual trees may well survive, but the population overall might be very susceptible to droughts and disease. And then you end up with dead trees, which of course are much more of a fire risk than live trees. So we're using this map that we've developed, and of course this could still be refined, sharing it with the town of Paradise. The Fire Safe Councils have this and are sharing it too. We're using it to pick out the trees that we're gonna order for spring 2021, when we're gonna do a much bigger replanting. A lot more people will have their lands cleared by then, we hope. We know that's been a huge delay for people not being able to get their trees removed in a timely manner. And I know that the Rotary Club and Butte Strong have actually helped the Fire Safe Council already with helping people get more trees removed. And I'm really grateful for that, because we can't move forward without that. So that's Paradise Ridge. And rebuilding paradises and reforesting Paradise is something that's really important, and we'll continue to talk about over a long time. And again, there's the Paradise Parks and Recreation District, even the Paradise Irrigation District is part of these conversations about how to best reforest the ridge and care for their lands. And so people sometimes talk about the silver linings of the fire. I guess one thing that is not terrible about the aftermath of the fire is that people already collaborated and talked to each other, but I think we're doing it even more now, which is good to see. You certainly wouldn't want the opposite. So if we just go a couple air miles east from Paradise, you find yourself in Concow. And, you know, I'm not from here. I've only lived in Butte County 3 or 4 years, but right after the fire, I realized what an incredible and really interesting place Concow is. I mean, most places in Butte County are, in fact, pretty interesting, it turns out. But Concow is really interesting because it's this low elevation forested watershed. And as I was reading through the literature and trying to understand how communities recover from fires like this, I realized most of the forestry research that we do in California is done up around like 4,000 and 5,000 feet on really high quality timber sites, which is great. I understand why we study timber where timber grows best. And I understand that most of the forestry studies that we do are going to be in timber because it's economically important, but most of us live a lot lower in elevation. And I think that these woodlands just really aren't studied very well. So I'd really like to, if possible, use this as an opportunity to do some research on how these lower elevation watersheds function. Concow, of course, has burned at pretty high severity already twice in the last 10 years. The Jarbo Gap winds, which if anything are just get more intense with each fire because we have lost the tall trees that used to shield the basin a little bit, really make that fire weather more intense. I'm probably not telling you anything you don't know. There's been some pretty major vegetation and cultural changes in the basin over the last 50 years and beyond. It wasn't really that long ago that the Maidu were managing the basin with regular fire and favoring oaks. And then when white settlers arrived, plenty of ranchers took over those regular fire traditions and burned the land fairly regularly. And then as the basin transitioned toward more of a timber identity, there was less and less fire. And then we kind of got into the era of total fire suppression, which has made the 20th century really so anomalous in the history of California. It's kind of strange to sit out there on a beautiful blue clear day in the fall and think that in a really dense forest in the park or someplace and think, you know, Californians haven't experienced this before. This is weird. To be in a dense forest where I can see a deer, but I can hear a deer, but I can't see it, and I can't smell smoke anywhere, is just something that we're kind of the first handful of generations of Californians to experience that. And so it's a very fragmented ownership. Most of Butte County is like this. This is why it's so interesting to live here. You go to other Sierran counties and the Forest Service owns like 95% of the county. So, or maybe the Forest Service and SPI or Collins Pine kind of split it. So there's 3 entities to negotiate with, but it's a lot more interesting here. That's why I like it. And there's cool plants up there. So this is a view looking up on Rim Road. So up at the north of that map we were just looking at, looking down to the lake. This is one of the higher severity parts of the campfire. Of course, not all of the campfire footprint looks like this. But you look at this, especially if you go up there fairly recently after the fire. I think this was February 2019. And you think to yourself, I have never seen anything like this in my life. And I don't know many people who have. And this is really something. But even then, life returns. These are some fawn lilies or erythronium sprouting after the fire. You know, there are certain plants, of course, that just thrive after a fire. This is another part of the campfire footprint, though, just a few miles away, and it's really kind of more representative of what forests experienced during the campfire. So this forest doesn't look that bad. It lost some trees, but kind of in a good way. It lost the number of trees that it needed to lose. Now it's a less dense forest. You know, all the same species are probably going to come back. You're not going to see a huge wholesale conversion from one type of vegetation community to another. So that's fine. And we don't want to meddle with parts of the forest that don't need restoration. You know, like fire is a force that can really do a lot of good, and forests need it. We know that. But then there are other parts of the campfire footprint, and they do tend to be in and around Concow and Yankee Hill, where the fire burned so hot that the only plants really able to recolonize the site are these chaparral plants. You've got your ceanothus and yerba santa and plants like that. And chaparral is great. It's a beautiful and very biodiverse vegetation community. But Californian forests have always kind of burned at high severity in pretty small patches. So a healthy forest, we like to say, is usually a mosaic. And when you have a big, big patch that all burns at high severity all at once, you get a big, big, big patch of chaparral that's all the same age, which means it's all going to senesce and die at the same time. And it's just a really vast field of fuel that's kind of designed to burn at high severity again. So you kind of get trapped in this cycle of high severity fire. You get to a landscape like this. This is actually the Ishii Wilderness about 1999, 1990, more like 30, about 30 years after the last big fire there. So you have a really, and there's other parts of Butte County that are like this too. You just have a really, really big continuous sheet of even-aged chaparral. And that's not really the best habitat. We would like to see more of a mosaic. And it's really not the best for public safety either. We'd like to see a vegetation community that might burn at a little lower severity or mixed severity. This is kind of a summary of what I've been trying to talk about. The bottom line is really that if you have a really big patch of chaparral that used to be forest, it's just not a very socially acceptable vegetation type because of the fire regime that I just described. So we would like to steer Concow and other areas in California that have experienced the same fate. We'd like to steer them away from wide-scale type conversion to chaparral if we can. Forests with big trees, even if the trees are very widely spaced, do sequester more carbon over the long term than chaparral, and that's something that the state of California is concerned about because we're kind of counting on our forests to save us and sequester a lot of the carbon that we've been pumping into the atmosphere. And if they're going to do that, we know what they need to look like. They need to have big trees that are widely spaced. That's not to say they can't have any chaparral in them. As I said before, healthy forests are a mosaic. And of course, there are whole parts of California that just need to be chaparral because they always have been, especially along the coast. Anyway, we want to replant trees and we want to reestablish forests if we can at all. And when I say forests, you know, that can mean oak woodlands too. We want to reestablish woodlands. But what I've found, and it's been kind of surprising to me in the first couple of years at my job, is that we're really good at planting conifers and planting hardwoods like oaks and madrones and dogwoods, buckeyes and redbuds that are also a really important part of our forests. We're just not really set up to do that in our reforestation programs. So right after the, well, let me go back. We know that our forests are kind of for all of the history of California in the last 10,000 years, they're kind of designed to have pretty open, not very dense stands of trees, so fewer trees overall than we're used to seeing. And a lot more of them historically have been oaks. Oaks, if the land burns pretty often, you get more oaks and fewer pines. We know that this is kind of a forest that might be considerably more fire resilient and considerably more climate resilient because oaks are kind of better at coping with heat and drought than pines, all else being equal. So now that we have this blank slate, at least in parts of Butte County, where we can kind of replant anything we want to replant, maybe we should plant fewer trees overall, and maybe more of them should be oaks. But as I mentioned, that's not what reforestation programs are always set up to do. Right after the fire, we started getting approached by all of these organizations, and they're great organizations, wanting to replant trees in our footprint of the campfire. And they mostly were just really set up to plant pine trees. And pine trees are important. They're a very important part of our forest, and we're definitely going to replant plenty of conifers for sure. But I just feel like there's this kind of institutional bias in favor of pine trees. I understand why that is. They're very economically important. Again, that makes them well studied. It makes them cheap. But there's also this cultural reason that pine plantations look like forests to us. And that's linked to what I was talking about just a few minutes ago, that we've all grown up in this anomalous century, in the 20th century, that's really been characterized by, even though we experience big fires now, the 20th century has been characterized by far fewer fires overall than California is used to supporting. It's been a century of fire suppression. And if you suppress fires, you get more pines and fewer oaks. So as evidence of this sort of cultural sense that continuous big pine forests are what forests really look like, I noticed that right after the fire, almost every visual expression of solidarity with the campfire survivors featured a pine tree. And the more I saw it, the more I mean, these are great, right? But as someone who thinks a lot about forestry issues, the number of pine trees that we had was kind of our problem. So I love a conifer as much as anyone else, don't get me wrong, but I can't think of a better symbol of strength, not to mention fire resilience, than an oak. So humbly submitted. This is sort of my viewed strong vision. Taking you back to Concow now, why do I think that there used to be more oaks in Concow? Well, because I've been going out there under contract with the Forest Service and through my job doing botany work and other work in the forest. And when you go out to some place like this, you see all these burned conifers. This just looks like a great big Doug fir forest that all burned over. And you can't see them because they're sensitive cultural resources that I did not take a photo of, but I'm standing on rocks that have deep mortars in them that were created by generations of Maidu women grinding acorns. And that tells us that this whole landscape used to be abundant enough in the amazing food crop that is acorns, that people were constantly grinding acorns everywhere you looked. There's more acorn grinding rocks out in Concow than our archaeologist said she had ever seen anywhere in California. So what looks like a conifer forest to us with our 20th century eyes is sort of a rightful mixed oak woodland in a sense. And the whole time I was out doing botany work across the Concow Basin, I saw one native conifer seedling coming back, but all of those green bushes that you see on the hillside are tan oak. So we wanted to create a reforestation response that might honor the oaks and the rightful extent of oak woodland that you might see across Butte County. And so in collaboration with the Forest Service and a bunch of local folks and the fire safe councils and other organizations, we tried to design this thing that we call the Concow Resilience Project. Right now, you're just looking at the federal lands portion of it, but instead of replanting a bunch of pine trees, we want to do oak woodland restoration and try to help the oaks along. Many of them are resprouting. There's places where oaks could probably stand to be planted, but there are a lot of places where they just kind of need to be, need a helping hand, maybe a little bit of reduction of the competing brush around them so that maybe they can grow up into an oak woodland. And maybe as we look into the future of Butte County, we'll be looking into an oak woodland instead of a dense pine forest. I told you you were just looking at the federal lands portion here, but it doesn't have to stop there. The private lands in Concow and Yankee Hill and really across Butte County can also benefit from grazing, more prescribed fire. Prescribed fire doesn't have to be inconsistent with growing good timber. There's an emerging field called pyrosilviculture that kind of focuses on reincorporating good fire into silviculture. There's plenty of research to be done out there. And we want to plant all the oaks that we can and give the oaks a bright future. So we started this spring in a small way doing oak plantings across Paradise and Concow. We planted about 1,000 oaks. We also planted a ton of pines on some non-industrial private forest landowners who had, they've already made the decision, I'm going to keep this land in timber because that's what it's always been, and that's a decision that is really important to them. But that doesn't mean that they can't also incorporate oaks for wildlife and other hardwoods and stuff like that. The current status of the project is that we're almost finished with the NEPA on the federal portion. Not that we have money to actually do it, but we're working on it. For private landowners, we are sending forestry technicians out now almost every day, despite COVID, to help develop forest management plans for people all across Concow, Yankee Hill, Butte Creek Canyon, Paradise, Magalia, the whole fire footprint, to help people replant resilient forests. We're connecting people with federal assistance, state assistance. I'm writing grants all the time to try to bring more money on into Butte County. It is a challenge to secure money to regenerate oaks and hardwoods because of the reasons I discussed before. We have this kind of bias towards conifers, but we're working on it. The RCD is about to get set up is about to set up a special reforestation fund through the North Valley Community Foundation, where we'll be able to accept donations for oak restoration and other things like that. And we continue to apply to different funding sources around California to help us restore Butte County to a really resilient landscape. And I think I have talked long enough. Thanks for listening. I would love to hear questions and comments and things like that. So I guess I'll turn it back over to Glenn. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Wolfy. That was terrific. We can open it up for questions for a couple minutes. Actually, I have one that I'd like to start off with, if that's okay. My wife Michelle, who's sitting behind me, and I forgot to introduce her, everybody, so you can ding me again. Believe it or not, Kelly has already billed me for that, so that's efficiency. So anyway, Michelle and I live up in Forest Ranch, so a couple ridges over from Paradise. Yeah. And even though our area wasn't directly impacted by the campfire, how should we be applying? How should our community be applying the principles you talked about as far as reforestation to our existing forest up here to keep it more fire safe?
That's a great question. So you should look around at the, I haven't been to your land, but some rules of thumb are that what the first settlers who came to California and wrote in their journals about California kind of still holds true. You should be able to, as they were able to, ride horses at a gallop through your forest. So if your forest is open enough that you would not hesitate to ride an expensive animal at high speed through it and not worry about that animal crashing into vines and saplings and stuff, then your forest is in good shape. And I think people should also start looking downhill and maybe look 500, even more feet in elevation downhill. See what the vegetation community is like down there. It doesn't mean that the vegetation community down there is necessarily healthy, because it also probably hasn't burned in a while, or it may have been affected by very high severity fire. But the species mix growing down there is probably what you can expect to be resilient at your elevation in fewer years than you may think. So you might look downhill and see a lot of black oak, even blue oak, depending on what part of Forest Ranch you live in. And you might think about opening up space and habitat for such that some of those species might have a chance to become better established. Another thing you can do is, depending on how much land you have and how it's configured and stuff, you can think about maybe learning more about prescribed fire. Forest Ranch is actually kind of Butte County's capital of prescribed fire. There's definitely more people there who know what they're doing with fire than any place else in the county. And it can be a pretty amazing way to deepen your relationship with your land to bring fire back onto your land.
All right, thank you. That's great. So any other questions for Wolfy? And Wolfy, if you've got the chat box open, there's some comments. I don't know if there's any questions there, but
there we go.
Look and see. But if there's anybody who would like to ask a question, now's a good time to do it. Open up your mic and/or your camera and see what we got. So.
Wolfy, this is Phil. We always learned about valley oaks when we moved to Chico and so on. They seem to be very important. Is that the type of tree that should be planted on the hills and so on, or does that have to be down in the hotlands at the bottom down here?
My understanding is that valley oaks have kind of a particular habitat niche where they do need to be down on not necessarily super hot sites, but they need to be kind of on pretty rich riparian sites. So it's usually not too far from a creek, because that's where there are pretty nice deep soils that they need to thrive on. If you go a little bit up further away from the creek where the soils can get pretty thin and gnarly pretty fast, then you get into blue oaks, which are probably more widely adapted across more of Butte County. So valley oaks do grow up to, I think there are valley oaks somewhere in California growing at almost 5,000 feet, but that's on really special sites where, again, there's just a lot of fertility there. That's my understanding.
Thanks, Phil. Any other questions?
Hi, my name is Jolene Francis. I was just wondering, and I apologize if I missed this part of the presentation, how much longer would it take to grow a fully mature oak woodland forest than it would a pine woodland forest?
In terms of full maturity, probably about the same amount of time. In terms of like reproductive maturity, they probably start fruiting at about the same age when they're still adolescent trees, in the sense of, they're not huge. I think about the same amount of time, it's fair to say. Like most oaks, like a really, really big oak is about the same age as a really, really big ponderosa pine. Depends on the site. Sorry, I can't give you a better answer.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Rob.
Yeah, and first of all, again, thank you, Wolfy. This is really informative. And I've lived in this area for over 30 years now in Southern California initially. And part of what drew me here were the oaks, and I just love them. We've lived in land, we've always had a couple of acres in the oaks. Unfortunately, some of the land we lived on, the oaks are of an age where they passed. We weren't irrigating them or anything, but they still, they went down. And to get to my question is, I'm puzzled at times to know how to try growing oak. I mean, I've had little acorns come up and put it in a pot and all that. So I'm wondering, who around this area could help, or whether I should just look for someplace to buy a tree that's several years old and plant it more like I've conventionally planted other trees. Because I will admit to planting some non-native trees in my property, but I would like to have some. And I'm down in Chico, I'm not up on the ridge, but who can you point me towards actually being able to get an oak on the ground and actually have it thrive?
Sure. Well, Floral Native Nursery here in Chico does a lot of wildland restoration projects, and they have pretty good oak stock. I've looked at a lot of nurseries, and oaks don't really do well in pots. It's probably better to plant oaks from acorns, but you can't always do that. So if you are going to buy an oak in a pot, honestly, buy the smallest one that you can. They'll be cheaper anyway, so you can buy a bunch and maybe one of them will survive. And go to a nursery like Floral, where they grow out for restoration projects, and they really know how to grow native trees, and they don't treat them like non-native trees, and ornamental trees, which tend to need kind of different treatment. But also, consider going out in the fall and gathering a bunch of acorns and just planting acorns around your property. That's really how oaks like to grow.
Okay, but in terms of when you start them, I mean, you dig a hole. I mean, how do you compete? I'll ask the floor nursery. I'm sure there's other people want to ask questions, but I think part of what I was doing wrong is I didn't know how to condition the soil, the hole it went into. And
I don't know that you need to do much. I mean, the thing is, oaks just naturally have a really low survival rate. If you think of how many acorns a mother tree can produce in a good acorn year, can you imagine if all those acorns survived, or if even 10% of those acorns survived? We would just be in an oak thicket all the time.
I'll take your point.
So, yeah, it's just kind of part of the way it is. You need to expect low survival, unfortunately.
And be persistent, I guess. Thank you again.
Yes, thank you.
All right, well, it's a little past 1:30, so I'll keep the room open if anybody wants to ask more questions. But for now, I will thank Wolfy for presenting to us today. It was very informative. Thank you for doing that. As you may have noticed from the beginning of our meeting, we are in our centennial year as a club here in Chico. And so we are working our big centennial project when we can start working on it again is going to be a neighborhood park over on Ceres Avenue. It'll be known as Rotary Centennial Park, and we will be making a donation in your name to that project. So,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
That's great.
For doing that. And
maybe we ought to plant a tree in her name.
Yeah, we may plant a tree in her name. That's an excellent idea, Phil. I was thinking about that same thing for just a second there. So anyway, thank you all for coming. Thanks, Wolfy. We will see you again this time next week. And for now, Mark, if you would ring us out, we'll adjourn.